In the United States alone, researchers estimate that over 27 million adults are currently estranged from a parent. That is not a small number of broken, ungrateful children. That is a pattern. And when something happens at that scale, psychology stops asking who is to blame and starts asking something far more important. What is actually going on inside these families? And what researchers found when they started looking closely was not what anyone expected. It was not about rebellion. It was not about influence from friends or toxic relationships or a generation that simply does not value family anymore. What they found was quieter than that, and far more disturbing. They found that in most cases the child had been trying, for years, sometimes for decades, trying to be understood, trying to be enough, trying to make the relationship work without losing themselves completely in the process. And at some point something shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but slowly, the way a bridge weakens before it collapses, one crack at a time, one ignored boundary at a time, one dismissed feeling at a time. Until one day, they made a decision that would cost them everything they were taught to value. And here is the question psychology has spent years trying to answer. What exactly pushes a person to that point? What happens inside a family system that makes a child feel that disappearing is safer than staying? And why, despite the guilt, despite the grief, despite the cultural shame of walking away from your own blood, do millions of people still choose to go? The answer begins somewhere most people never look. It begins in childhood, long before the decision was ever made. Most people assume estrangement starts with a big moment, an explosive argument, an unforgivable betrayal, a single event so damaging that the relationship could never recover. But psychology says something different. It almost never starts with one thing. It starts with atmosphere. The kind of home where love felt conditional, where emotions were either dismissed or weaponized, where being yourself carried a consequence, where you learned very early that keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth. Children raised in these environments do not grow up thinking about cutting ties. They grow up thinking about surviving, about shrinking themselves just enough to avoid the next storm. And here is what makes it so invisible. From the outside, these families often look completely normal: presentable homes, family dinners, birthday photos, the kind of life that looks whole from a distance. But behind closed doors, something else was happening entirely. And the child living inside that something else had no language for it, no framework, no way to explain why they felt so exhausted, so invisible, so fundamentally unseen inside the very place that was supposed to feel like home. That feeling has a name now. And once you understand what it is, everything about estrangement starts to make sense. Psychologists call it emotional neglect. And before you move past those two words, understand this: it is not what most people picture when they hear the word neglect. There are no visible bruises, no dramatic scenes, no moment you can point to in court or explain at a dinner table without someone saying, "But are you sure you are not overreacting?" That is exactly what makes it so dangerous. Because emotional neglect is defined not by what happened to you, but by what never did. No one ever asked how you really felt. No one noticed when something was wrong. No one sat with you in your pain without immediately trying to fix it, minimize it, or make it about themselves. You were fed, you were clothed, you went to school, on paper everything was fine. But something essential was missing, something a child cannot name but can absolutely feel. And the human brain, especially a child's brain, is wired to interpret that absence in the most damaging way possible. Not as a failure of the parent, but as a failure of the self. So the child grows up believing something quietly devastating: that they are too much, or not enough, or simply not worth the emotional effort it takes to truly know them. And they carry that belief into every relationship they will ever have. Until something finally cracks it open. So the next time you hear about someone who cut ties with their parents, before you judge, before you assume, before you call them ungrateful or selfish or broken, remember this: nobody walks away from a family that made them feel loved. Nobody abandons warmth. Nobody escapes safety. People only leave what was hurting them. And choosing to stop the pain is not betrayal. It is not weakness. It is not giving up. It is survival. Psychology does not see these millions of adults as children who failed their families. It sees them as people who finally, after years of trying, chose themselves. And that is not something to judge. That is something to understand. If this opened your eyes even slightly, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts below, your story matters here. And remember this above everything else. Healing is not about forgetting where you came from. It is about finally giving yourself permission to decide where you are going. Take care of yourself. You have already survived the hardest part.